The Colorado Resilience Collaborative aims to provide foundational information on the trends, definitions, and practices related to targeted violence prevention and related issues such as hate crimes and identity-based violence. The following 4 modules that make up this series give valuable information that serve to develop new skills and strengthen existing ones in the context of an agency or community and focus on awareness along with prevention and intervention skills.
Hi, I'm Dr. Maria Vukovic, and I am the Program Director of the Resilience Collaborative within the University of Denver.
And I'm Max Murray, the Program Coordinator of the Resilience Collaborative.
Our program at the University of Denver is focused on strengthening prevention of targeted violence, identity-based violence, and hate. By offering extensive training, professional mental health consultation, and educational resources, our aim is to build the capacity of agencies, professionals, and communities to expand awareness and skills for identifying and responding to concerning behaviors related to targeted violence and hate. Our team consists of experienced researchers, licensed mental health providers, and educators who tailor prevention resources and recommendations to each referral we receive into our program. Our prevention program is housed within the University of Denver's International Disaster Psychology graduate program that focuses on trauma and global mental health. Our work is informed by expertise in mental health, global studies, trauma, war, conflict, culture, and the environment. Thanks for this opportunity to speak about targeted violence and violent extremism. It's a problem that historically has affected Colorado greatly and a threat that has been rapidly changing and increasing recently. We are grateful for your attention to the issue of targeted violence, violent extremism, and hate crimes in our communities.
We encourage you to reference our video, An Introduction to Targeted Violence Prevention, for more background on the Resilience Collaborative and targeted violence in Colorado. We hear a lot of ambiguous and challenging information about these issues and the situations and groups in which they are carried out. So we wanted to discuss current landscape and trends that we're seeing more. Maria, one question I often hear from folks is whether violent extremism and targeted violence is on the rise in general.
Yes, there actually has been a marked increase in domestic terrorism as well as violent extremism across the country in the last several years. It's critical to understand the gravity of these threats and how they're evolving in relation to our nation's democracy. In fact, the Biden-Harris administration stated that domestic terrorism is now posing the most significant and persistent threat to our nation's security. In response, the administration has actually established the first national strategy for countering domestic terrorism, and that does include targeted violence, as evidence of their commitment to addressing violence while also protecting civil liberties and rights. Recent analysis that was done by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, a nonpartisan organization, has indicated that domestic terrorism and targeted violence carried out by extremist groups are actually surging and at their highest levels in decades. This is based on data from 1994 to last year, 2021. Data has suggested that the vast majority of domestic terror and violent extremism activity is being driven by white supremacy, as well as anti-Muslim, anti-government, and authority ideologies. Ongoing racial injustice, political and social unrest, and the COVID pandemic have all intensified and at times emboldened violent extremism across the spectrum from far right to far left movements in the country. Of primary concern, a disproportionate number of victims have been impacted by recent attacks and plots carried out by far right violent extremism. This activity has been directed at people who identify as Black, Brown, Indigenous, and Native, Asian, Jewish, Muslim, New Americans, including refugees and immigrants, LGBTQIA2+ individuals, as well as other minoritized backgrounds. Places of worship, health service clinics, and government buildings have also been targeted and adversely affected by the uptick in violent extremism recently. CSIS data has indicated far-right extremism attacks and threats lead to many more deaths and injuries and armed conflict than the far-left extremism. Since 2015, the individuals and groups motivated by far-right extremist views have carried out 267 attacks, resulting in 91 deaths, as compared to far-left extremists who have been involved in 66 reported incidents with 19 fatalities. So there's quite a divide between the effects of either extremist activity. The Anti-Defamation League, or ADL, has also reported a stark increase in white supremacist propaganda efforts in 2020. For example, in 2020, there were 5,125 incidents reported, as opposed to 2,724 in 2019. This averages to be more than 14 incidents a day, for example, and only includes incidents of propaganda that are reported, which we know are typically grossly underreported. The ADL has implicated 3 far-right groups are responsible for around 92% of recent activity. Another concern is the splintering of various groups into smaller cells of homegrown militia that operate somewhat independently. A common practice among right-wing militia, an ecosystem of group affiliations that could all more or less trace their roots back to a larger foundational ideologically motivated group, may be fractured from the original violent extremist ideology. When groups fracture, they often evolve and take on unique characteristics based on the landscape, the region, and other predominant issues and values that are driving their ideological views and behaviors. In that sense, they become new groups. For example, offshoots of the 3 percenters have been shown to be more active in southern and southwestern Colorado, and their activity and values are linked to and independent from their parent or overarching violent extremist group. So Max, can you tell us a little bit more about what we know to be driving right-wing extremism?
Absolutely. And this is a complex discussion in and of itself. It's often not a single factor. For example, accelerationism, or the active agitation of systems with the goal of structural collapse and conflict or civil war. Anti-immigrant beliefs, anti-LGBTQIA2+ beliefs, and nationalism are all examples of ideological pathways that lead to radicalization and mobilization to violence in the context of right-wing extremism. It's important to note that not all those who become involved in such groups have perceivable grievances or ideological motives. Recruiters across violent extremist groups use vulnerabilities as inroads to encourage and influence participation. Additionally, tacit and open support, as expressed by various politicians, can have impact in terms of a group's ability to gain public traction, act in public spaces, disrupt functions like school board meetings, and presumably recruit. These groups, specifically racially motivated violent extremists and white supremacists, are showing a trend, as reported by the Department of Homeland Security, away from larger syndicates like the Ku Klux Klan into smaller groups or individual, predominantly unaffiliated actors. Facebook and other public social media platforms have been utilized by these communities to recruit with mounting frequency and effectiveness. Concurrent with this trend, those interfacing with and recruited into these groups and movements are increasingly younger. Other risk factors commonly exacerbating involvement in right-wing extremism include concerns with accessible economic, informational, and communal resources, as well as exposure to violence at both formative and older ages.
And now, can you tell us a bit more about what we know to be driving left-wing extremism?
Left-wing violent extremism has been notably more difficult to track. While there is much debate around categorization of groups, ideologies, and approaches, part of the reason that some law enforcement authorities at the federal level tend to label these groups as posing lesser risk is that in general, many who identify as part of the far left are more gun averse. In other words, it is not so much that they are not engaging in concerning behaviors motivated by extremism, but instead that they tend to use less armed force. This is an important point when thinking about preventing violent extremism and its potential impact on democracy in general. It's critical to look not only at where the most harm is being done in the most lethal ways, but also at what are the common drivers pushing individuals into involvement with violent extremist groups, involvement that could have negative impacts on their well-being and the safety of those around them. In response to this lack of clarity, it can be important, especially for those who find themselves in a community with those who are being targeted by the activities of any of these groups or becoming involved in them, to shift the focus away from static definitions and ideological boxes to place them into. Focusing instead on the risk factors and protective factors in a person's life can lead to a more effective prevention practice in general and give greater clarity to the drivers that push radicalization to violence into mobilization. In other words, understanding why a person has turned to violent extremism and what internal need they are attempting to meet is a potentially more sustainable and effective prevention practice than studying any specific group ideology. In fact, some research has shown in pivotal points when an individual disengages from violent extremist activity but has not yet ideologically de-radicalized, they may be at risk to onboard into another seemingly opposing group. Case examples include disengaging former neo-Nazis joining various ISIS-based groups, and in some cases vice versa. This may be due to common beliefs between the groups that are more foundational. Anti-Semitism and anti-American government beliefs are both relevant to the above example. There are some researchers who describe that as kind of ideological highways that can connect seemingly opposing groups. The potential for people to disengage and then engage in another group is further evidence of the importance of prevention at all levels, before, during, and after engagement. It also further highlights both the importance of the role ideology can play and also its nebulous and often very confusing nature as expressed in people's apparent ability to move rather flexibly between seemingly oppositional groups. So the US Department of Justice calls both groups a danger to the United States. In what ways, Maria, do they pose a threat to our country?
Well, effectively and responsibly addressing the complex and evolving domestic terror as well as violent extremism threat landscape is critical to protecting and honoring our nation's security, values, civil rights, and civil liberties. Prevention efforts require enhanced coordination and collaboration across multiple levels, federal, state, and community actors. There also needs to be greater emphasis and resources placed on addressing factors that contribute to the incitement and engagement with violent extremism online and offline, as both contribute to violence and the erosion of safety and stability in communities. With any group that engages in acts of targeted violence and does so for the purposes of limiting the civil rights and liberties of another individual or group, persecuting or further minoritizing individuals and communities, or furthering political agendas, a major part of what can make them dangerous is their ability to exploit existing gaps in a community's resources and support. Talking about what drives people from engaging in this behavior and what prevents them from exiting those contexts, including push and pull factors, as they're often described in literature, sheds light on the conditions that made involvement in these groups possible in the first place. It's often a gap that can be addressed through mental health services, social connection with trusted peers and loved ones, equipping caregivers with knowledge and skills to speak and to respond to these challenging issues with their young people, as well as increasing funding, the development and support of decisive structural support for those who are affected by violent extremism.
Well, we want to thank you for taking the time to listen to this first video and to interface with the material that we're presenting, not only in this video, but in the ones to come. Our contact information will be posted not only in the body of our video, but also in the slides themselves in the videos to come. So thank you again.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for clicking on this recording. Your hosts today are going to be me, Tab Gleason, as well as Elena Sawyer. We are graduate students from the University of Denver, working with the Colorado Resilience Collaborative, also known as the CRC. The CRC is housed under the University of Denver, is focused on strengthening prevention of violence, hate, and discrimination. We offer extensive training, professional mental health consultation, and educational resources.
Welcome to our first recorded segment. In this video, we're going to be giving you a high-level overview of violence in America by defining a few key terms and sharing some recent statistics.
We will also give a brief introduction to the process of preventing targeted violence, what we can do, and why it matters. This segment is a great place to start before diving into any of the more specific topics in other segments, or if you're just looking for some more general information.
Before we jump in, we want to acknowledge that we will be sharing a few examples of targeted violence in this segment as well as others. Our hope is that in sharing these examples, we can help to better demonstrate some of the abstract or challenging ideas that come up on this topic. That said, we do want to state that the CRC takes an apolitical stance in sharing these anecdotes. That is not to say that all of the examples we share are not politically motivated. In fact, many of them are. However, in presenting this information to you, the CRC aims to present facts and honor the dignity of everyone. Our apolitical stance does not imply a lack of care or concern. To the contrary, the CRC operates on the firm belief that our communities thrive when everyone in them feels safe. Our work promotes prevention of violence, particularly against those who are most often targeted or minoritized. Our goal is to promote safety in our communities for everyone in our communities.
We also want to acknowledge that some of the topics we will be discussing may be distressing to hear about. We encourage that everyone listening take care of themselves in this context. Your awareness of the thoughts or emotions that come up through this work is crucial. Desensitization to this material is not effective. Rather, in acknowledging your own reactions and by taking time to care for your well-being, you are demonstrating an important skill needed in supporting people who may be the target of violence or who may be at risk of engaging in it. So, Elena, why is this work important and how does it impact us?
Targeted violence includes hate crimes, bias-motivated incidents, and other forms of interpersonal violence. Such events make our communities feel less safe. They affect us even if we may not be involved directly in the incident or included in the targeted group. Acts of violence impact our perceptions of safety, our children's perception of safety. They impact public policy, community health, social behavior, and collective mental health through the impact of shared trauma experiences and the perpetuation of anger, hate, and fear. Often, targeted violence is directed towards individuals, and it could be that someone you care about is the target of or is engaging with targeted violence. Colorado has a complex history with targeted violence and mass tragedy. Since the Columbine High School tragedy of 1999, there have been more than 10 other incidents that have affected 2 or more people, including those that occurred at the Aurora Theater in 2012, the Boulder King Supers in 2021, and the Soul Tribe Tattoo Parlor in 2021. In 2019 to 20 alone, there were over 300 instances of reported violent extremism and anti-Semitism, including 1 extremist murder, 1 terrorist plot and attack, 5 white supremacist events, 87 white supremacist propaganda incidents, and 113 anti-Semitic instances. It's important to remember also that with hate crimes, these numbers are likely a wild underrepresentation of the whole context. Often those who are most commonly the targets of hate crimes are also those who may be mistreated by legal groups or law enforcement, or who otherwise feel distrust towards those entities. Thus, we actually have to assume that the levels of such violence are much greater. We can see the impact of violent extremism in online content as well. One of our partners, Moonshot, collects, analyzes, and presents data collected from online sources such as Facebook engagement, keyword searches, etc., to show how individuals may be interacting with some of the themes around identity-based violence online. This helps us to potentially understand trends and themes and to understand the pathway an individual may take to engaging in targeted violence. Now, before I share some of these findings, I do just want to remind all of you listening and viewing to protect your mental health. The next visual does show some specific racial and ethnic slurs related to online searches, which may be triggering. So we encourage everyone to exercise self-awareness and invite you to skip ahead over the next minute if you find the information displayed to be too distressing. So as you can see on this slide, with these reports from Moonshot, we can see that in 2019 to 2020, the most widely searched terms were associated with violent extremism related to neo-Nazism and white supremacy rhetoric. This can be shown in the words that you see on the screen. The larger they are, the more they have been searched. Of those search terms, 78% were searched by men and 48% were in young adulthood, ages 16 to 34. The counties with the greatest number of such searches by capita were Grand, Gilpin, Denver, Summit, Dolores, and Archuleta. Now, at this point, it would probably be helpful to share some more specific definitions around the language that we've been using up to this point. Tab, do you want to take this from here?
Absolutely. So targeted violence involves dangerous actions towards another individual that are intended to intimidate, coerce, and/or generate publicity. These actions are planned and intentional and can target individuals or property based on perceived identity traits. The word perceived here is key, as it doesn't actually matter if the target holds the assumed identity or not. Violent extremism is the belief that a group's success or survival requires violent action against an outgroup. Not all targeted violence acts are the result of violent extremism, but most people involved in violent extremism are engaging in targeted violence. Radicalization is the process by which a person adopts radical positions on social or political issues. Not all radicalization is bad or dangerous, but radicalization to violence, however, indicates that an individual feels they can justify violence in order to achieve certain goals. This may be due to some perceived grievance, which we'll be talking about in another segment. Radicalization to violence may begin with a grievance against an individual or a group. This may translate to discrimination, then harassment. Mobilization occurs when an individual begins making preparations to engage in violence. Mobilization, if carried out, results in hate crimes and targeted violence. So bringing it back to current statistics, to help us illustrate some of this, it may be helpful to look again at the data that Moonshot collects. Again, as a reminder, please be aware that the following visual contains potentially distressing information, and you should take steps to protect your own mental and emotional well-being. So looking at 2020 to 2021, Moonshot took a closer look at the potential level of risk of the online searches. They coded search terms that mirror the journey from radicalization to violence to mobilization. This data is based on levels of active or perceived violence initiatives and familiarity with the internal jargon of known violent extremist groups, which indicates higher integration. Of those searching these terms, 53% related to political violence and 32% to armed groups. Per capita, the counties with the highest level risk searches, specifically for white supremacy, were Chappie, Denver, and Montrose. The counties with the highest level risk searches for election-related violence were Denver, Pueblo, and then Boulder.
Now, at this point, we realize we've shared a lot of difficult information. Remember that if you're feeling overwhelmed by any of these insights, it's completely understandable and actually demonstrates an acute sense of self-awareness. Your active engagement in this topic is actually one of the best ways for us to prevent targeted violence. So on that topic, let's talk about what preventing targeted violence is, why it's important, and why it needs to happen at the community level. Previously, the technique most used in this space was called CVE, Countering Violent Extremism. This was largely reactive and did not focus on resiliency programming. In recent years, there has been a national shift from focusing on CVE and profiling to the more comprehensive resiliency-based approach of PTV, Preventing Targeted Violence. This is about generating foundational practices and systems to prevent identity-based violence. It is collaborative and it's focused on the development of resources to be immediately implemented. PTV implements all the ways we can work together as a community to prevent targeted violence. In fact, a public health approach is seen as the most effective method for prevention because it brings together experts across many fields and diverse backgrounds. It aims to protect the health, safety, and well-being of all those in the community by first fostering resilient communities. Resilient communities are those that promote protective resources, including mental health services, and reduce risks associated with violent extremism. As the first line of protection, we can work to ensure that all individuals have access to positive, supportive relationships. This will be further discussed in another segment of our recorded library.
So by expanding your awareness of targeted violence, the last steps that lead to it, and the ways we can prevent it and respond to it, you are becoming an integral piece of this approach. Should you want any additional training resources about targeted violence, or if you have any questions about prevention, or feel concerned for an individual in your life that you worry may be at risk of participating in or being targeted by violence, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at the CRC. Our contact information is listed below. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Your hosts from the Colorado Resilience Collaborative, or the CRC, are myself, Elena Sawyer, a graduate student at the University of Denver, and joining me today is Dr. Colby Rogers, a clinical lead with the Colorado Resilience Collaborative. In this segment, we're going to be looking more closely at what may lead an individual to violent extremism. We will look at why profiling in a traditional sense is not helpful in assessing individual risk, how trauma and grievances may impact radicalization to violence, and how to recognize factors that push an individual out or pull them in to different groups. We will end with some basic information about developing interventions, the actions that may help to interrupt an individual's radicalization to violence, and we will examine the process of de-radicalization and disengagement. Now, before we jump in, we do just want to acknowledge that we will be sharing a few examples of targeted violence in this segment. Our hope is that in sharing these examples, we can help to better demonstrate abstract and challenging ideas. That said, as a reminder, it's very important that you take care of your own mental health throughout this recording. Your awareness of the thoughts or emotions that come up during this work is crucial. Desensitization to the material is not effective. So your acute self-awareness and your active engagement in this topic are really the best ways to help prevent targeted violence. We also want to remind you that the CRC takes an apolitical stance in sharing these anecdotes. That is not to say that the examples we will share are not politically motivated. In fact, many of them are. However, in presenting this information to you, the CRC aims to present facts and to honor the dignity of everyone. Our work promotes prevention of violence, particularly against those who are often most targeted or minoritized. Our goal is to promote safety in our communities for everyone in our communities. So let's get ourselves started here in talking about profiling versus a different concept called pathways. For many people, I think the inclination is to try to identify specific characteristics they think are associated with individuals who participate in targeted violence. It gives a sense of safety, thinking that we can easily recognize people who may be a threat to us or our communities. Colby, can you explain the concept of profiling in a bit more detail and talk about why, in fact, it is not effective in the prevention of targeted violence?
Absolutely, Elena, and thank you so much, and thank you all for listening. As Elena stated, I'm Colby Rogers. I'm one of the clinic leads with the Colorado Resilience Collaborative. Elena brings up a good point. I think as one of our psychologists that have kind of studied this pretty heavily, Ariel Marari, states, there is no terrorist profile that has ever been founded. Now, I think in looking at that, we first have to kind of look at the concept of what profiling actually is. We hear that terminology in forensic psychology quite a bit, psychological profiling or criminal profiling, so to speak, which is generally thought of as a method of suspect identification, which leads an individual to identify a person's mental, emotional, or personality characteristics based upon actions or actions committed, such as crimes, etc. Profiling gives us the capacity we want to believe there's a typology, a person or a demographic that commits acts of terroristic violence or violent extremism. We want to believe, as J. Reed Malloyd states in the International Threat Assessment Handbook, in monocausal explanations, things such as psychopathology, narcissism, or sociodemographic traits that profile or lead an individual necessarily into targeted violence. However, what we've seen is in its early decades, terrorism studies fixated on the idea of developing a profile, but we understand now that the profile is kind of out of scope. When something out of the scope of understanding generally occurs, it appears that we as society or individuals need to create a distance, some sort of typology that makes sense of unprecedented, dare we say, and we often do, unprecedented evil. So when acts of targeted violence or violent extremism occur, it creates a collective fear, so to speak, a shattering of safety, a shattering of perspective in individuals. And under these circumstances, it makes sense to think that an individual, that there's a typology or someone to blame or to punish for this. However, profiling can seem to be an oddly comforting black and white answer to rationalize an atrocity that we understand now doesn't reap results in anything equating more than us going down additional rabbit holes. As the 20th century British philosopher Bertrand Russell stated, he states collective fear stimulates herd instinct and tends to produce ferocity toward those who are not regarded as members of the herd. I believe that this collective fear becomes an anxiety in search of answers. Profiling stimulates illogical reasons for the irrational actions that are targeted violence. So instead of searching for the elusive profile, I think what researchers and what us in the field need to do is increasingly embrace two principles. That there are, number one, multiple pathways into violent extremism. And number two, different people with similar initial states may produce different outcomes. So I think in order for us to kind of more effectively look at targeted violence, we need to look much more at pathways to violence as opposed to what they state as the profiling of someone that commits violent extremist acts.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you for explaining that more. And I think too, from what I'm hearing you say, profiling really doesn't fit very well into our preventative model anyway, which, as we've talked about in previous segments, the CRC fits into. I feel like just listening to your description, that's because really profiling sort of assumes that the individual has already been radicalized, whereas the preventative, resilient approach that the CRC tries to take is combating targeted violence is actually, it can be much more optimistic. It takes into account human resiliency and the potential for change, that an individual really can alter their behavior if met with the right systems of support.
Absolutely, Elena. And I know that a lot of what we speak about in terms of targeted violence and violent extremism is a very heavy topic that can almost sound with a very pessimistic connotation, of course. But towards the end of our kind of segment today, I would like to pose the concepts of post-traumatic growth as well, and understanding that through this kind of idea of looking at pathways as opposed to profiles, we can look at how certain things that we'll discuss later on, risk and protective factors, or push and pull factors, can play into assisting an individual to de-radicalization, and thus kind of celebrating a level of vicarious resilience and post-traumatic growth.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to getting to that point in our conversation too. So just to back up here for the moment, if we've talked about why profiling is not actually useful in preventing targeted violence, can you explain a little bit more about the pathways approach that we use instead?
The saddening truth is that there's a myriad of reasons which individuals engage in kind of violent extremism. These reasons can differentiate anything from curiosity to peer pressure, to identity seeking, to perhaps a cognitive fixation. Social isolation, which we'll talk about the COVID-19 pandemic and understanding that did not do any favors to our collective society in terms of isolation and violent extremism. And there's also other factors related and unrelated to mental health. So I think when we talk about a pathway to violence, one of the common concepts of a pathway to violence has been modeled by certain pathway to violence modalities that have been utilized, such as there's the Calhoun-Weston model, which looks at the pathway to violence being on a path ranging from observation, which can include aspects such as cognitive openings, the idea of something, perceived grievance that we'll talk about here in a little bit. Then there could be a triggering event. And then there could be, after the triggering event, violent ideation and fantasy. And then the intervention turns into, on this pathway, so to speak, we go from this idea of observation into intervention, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. And under the intervention phases from Calhoun-Weston's model, from KGH, which is the Kiernan Group Holdings, they state that we go from planning to preparation, then to approach and to attack. So the Calhoun-Weston model kind of gives a 7 layered pathway in which individuals engage in targeted violence. Another one of those models that have been highly utilized is from the individual Fathali Moghaddam, who has Moghaddam's staircase. Fathali Moghaddam is an Iranian-born psychologist that had worked out of Georgetown and looked at a staircase model to violent extremism and kind of looked at it in the concept of like a ground floor all the way up to a fifth floor of an escalation process in that pathway, with the ground floor being like kind of the psychological interpretation of material conditions, all the way leading from perceived options to unfair treatment in the first floor, which we'll talk more about when we discuss perceived grievances, to the second floor of the displacement of aggression. So, aggression forced in an alternative direction. The third floor being a moral engagement, and the fourth floor being solidification of categorical thinking. And finally, on the fifth floor, we have the terroristic act or sidestepping inhibitory mechanisms, so to speak. So many of these pathways or models were kind of first developed years ago or decades ago, so to speak, by the individual Yuri Bronfenbrenner. Yuri Bronfenbrenner was created this concept that he created this social ecological model, which was developed in the 1970s. And in it, in this model, it is almost like kind of a Russian doll model where at the core is the individual, and then expanding out is the relationships that we occur. Then a third layer kind of from the core is the community, and then the fifth layer being society. Now, Bronfenbrenner is kind of more known for kind of starting the Head Start program and looking at childhood poverty, and went and testified in Congress in the 1960s on behalf of kind of how all of these environmental factors play into an individual engaging in acts that we would see as probably terroristic, violent, aggressive, or impeding their mental health in certain aspects.
Okay, that's really helpful. And I know we have some visuals linked on the slide as well, and more resources below in the description as well. So if people find any of this interesting, they can feel free to dig more into all of these modalities as well. We've mentioned grievances now a couple of times, and sort of perceived grievances playing a role in the radicalization to violence. I wonder if this might be a good time for us to expand upon that a little bit more.
Okay, yes, Elena, we will kind of address the concept of perceived grievances, so to speak, throughout the duration of us kind of having this chat. Whereas, if you think about the concept of a perceived grievance can be something that is either ideological or belief based. That can include concepts such as we've become very aware in our current society and of fascism and anti-fascism, and the spectrums that those serve under ideological. We can look at faith or religion under perceived grievances that are ideological. That can be faith, religion, or spirituality. Or we can look at conspiracy theories that are under ideological. Of course, if we look at fascist versus anti-fascism, that kind of concept has come pretty much full steam ahead over the course of the past, 4 to 5 years, we'd say, where that concept has entered our kind of daily lexicon on a much more consistent basis. In 1935, an art dealer by the name of James Waterman Wise stated, "If fascism comes, it will not be identified with any shirt movement nor with any insignia, but it will probably be wrapped up in the American flag and heralded as a plea for liberty and preservation of the Constitution." So we can look, that was in 1935, and we look at concepts such as the insurrection of January 6th that occurred in 2021. And then also in May 31st of 2020, on the other side of the spectrum of this kind of ideological perceived grievance, the Trump administration declared in May 31st of 2020 that Antifa is a terrorist organization. So we can see how both ends of the spectrum of that end have a perceived grievance, but also kind of can be seen from various points or various ideations as a terroristic threat. Under faith and religion or spirituality, we had, sadly enough, in 2009, the Fort Hood shootings that occurred from an individual that felt that his faith was being impeded upon by the U.S. military and went in as a psychiatrist and committed an atrocity at Fort Hood in 2009. Also, we can look at concepts of conspiracy, which the idea of QAnon has been extremely kind of presented over the course of the past 5 or 7 years, so to speak, as well. I think 2017, so it's probably been about 5 years. 2017 is when QAnon was first introduced, and a recent poll showed that 17% of Americans believe some core falsehood that is being echoed from QAnon. And so that could be anything from the Pizzagate, as we've understood, to a group of Satan worshiping elites who are running a child sex ring, to concepts of flat earthers, things that we've heard a lot of. But if we look at it, 17% of Americans have believed some concept of that. And that would be how it is perceived as a grievance, a perceived grievance of conspiracy. Then we can move to like prejudiced and bias based kind of incentives for perceived grievance. A second concept of perceived grievance could be prejudiced and bias based, which could look at anti-immigration laws that we've seen where violence has been permeated from that aspect, anti-LGBTQI2 plus, and also racism. If we recall in June of 2015, the atrocities that occurred at the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church, where an individual attended a Bible study and committed an act of terroristic violence on a hallmark of the civil rights movement, a church that was heavily involved in the civil rights movement. A third concept of a perceived grievance could be like political. This can be anti-government, such as the insurrection of January 6, 2021. It can be pro-authoritarian. We see individuals taking a lot of stances on the Second Amendment, gun laws, etc. So a perceived grievance is the ideology where a lot of individuals that are moving forward in acts of targeted violence are making statements such as, I had to, my back was against the wall. And so perceived grievance can almost be justification that is community-based supported of acting upon in terms of violence as a last resort or means to make a stance for their ideological beliefs.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think the concept of grievances and perceived grievances is so interesting because to some extent, we all sometimes feel that sting of injustice in our day-to-day lives, right? And I think we all sometimes have these moments of feeling like, something isn't fair. We have this grievance, but the steps, and I like the sort of stepwise model that we saw in the previous slides of how this sort of evolves, going from a perceived grievance to then targeting who you think is responsible for that grievance and then justifying violence in that way against that group, I think is what makes this so different than maybe the grievances we feel throughout our day to day. So can you speak a little bit about what might cause that difference or that shift from someone feeling the perceived grievance to those next steps of aggression, of joining some of these communities that you say are helping to justify this ideology, to sort of moving up that staircase, if you will?
There's a reason that we have kind of the mental health field talking about a topic that has normally been held in law enforcement and kind of militant populations, handling violent extremism, etc. But what we're looking at is the way that in which trauma plays a huge factor. While we're not looking at a profile, so to speak, what we do understand is that childhood trauma, what we refer to as kind of there's certain factors, as we could state, that would assist in an individual perpetuating targeted violence. And we look at what are referred to as dynamic factors, and then we look at what are referred to as static factors. And then we'll kind of look at those and then how those interplay with trauma. So static risk factors are features of the offender's history that predict recidivism, but are not really deliberate interventions such as prior offenses. They're things you can't necessarily change. So if we look at static factors, they're historic things that cannot be altered about the individual. In another segment that we'll be discussing, we'll talk about the ACEs study, the Adverse Childhood Experience Study, which looks at a checklist of about 10 questions which an individual asks about kind of their childhood. Was there incarceration, substance usage, neglect and abuse, etc. in the home? And we'll highlight that more in a later segment. But the ACEs study has been a very good indicator also of individuals that have perpetuated targeted violence. And static factors such as the ACEs study are things that an individual has no control over changing. You cannot change, so to speak, your traumatic history. You cannot change your psychological diagnoses if accurate. You cannot change aspects of your socioeconomic conditions growing up, etc. But then dynamic factors are defined by their ability to change throughout a life course. And this is where I see real promise in kind of looking at programs and circumstances that assist in looking at an individual's dynamic factors and really assisting in altering change towards that targeted violence or radicalized ideology. Under dynamic factors, we have what are referred to as stable dynamic factors, which can be like personality traits. These can be anything from xenophobic to homophobic beliefs, which are pretty ingrained in the personality, but do have capacity to change. And then we have acute dynamic factors, which are individuals experiencing homelessness, poverty, drug usage. When we get into push and pull factors here in a little bit, we'll see how those interplay quite heavily in terms of an individual's radicalization and therefore their de-radicalization as well. I think as we're talking about static and dynamic factors, we're also kind of reflecting a little bit on Bronfenbrenner's social ecological model. And I have to reflect on his model looks at the individual again, relationships, the community, and societal connections. And if we look at this and you think about that, the individual, relationships, community, and then societal connections, all of these were kind of exacerbated or affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, which I think our world is undergoing what we'd refer to now as a collective trauma. A collective trauma is kind of this idea where the whole community has been affected. It was first introduced in a concept in a book in the 1970s, looking at a flood that occurred in a community and how this one flood affected the whole community for an exacerbated period of time. The psychologist Dr. Jacqueline Mack Harris, who studied collective trauma, states, when trauma is experienced collectively, the impact is collective. As a result of collective trauma, multiple people in a community, or in the case of a global pandemic, people all over the world are at risk for experiencing the physical and emotional effects of the trauma. If not addressed, collective trauma leads to new societal norms born out of the negative effects of trauma, such as, and I'll highlight these concepts, fear, anxiety, hopelessness, and avoidance. All of those are kind of like the four horsemen that lead an individual to radicalization of targeted violence. Also, we look at individuals were kind of siloed into their own aspects of their own news sources. They were not forced to be around individuals that had differentiated beliefs or ideologies in person. Everything was kind of managed via telehealth, everything. And so our capacity to be around those that ideologically thought differently than us kind of exacerbated this collective trauma and allowed us to kind of each go down our own rabbit hole and create almost like a foolproof plan as to, or foolproof reasoning as to why we believe in what manner in which we believe.
Thanks for putting that into such great perspective. It's pretty clear that the pandemic has exacerbated a lot of these factors and conditions. And I do just want to take this opportunity, since we're talking about how the mental health sphere has sort of come into play with this whole process. We've been talking, of course, a lot about mental illness as a potential risk factor in talking about, substance misuse and talking about trauma, et cetera. And so I just want to offer a quick note here that when we mention mental illness, we're not implying that people with mental illness are more dangerous or are more likely to commit violent crimes. We're also not suggesting that all who commit targeted violence have mental illness. And we don't mention all of this with the intention of increasing sympathy for perpetrators of targeted violence. However, it's important for us to mention mental illness, as you have Colby as a social factor that may contribute to a person's distress. Because if we're more aware of this, then we can actively be working to ensure that individuals have the support they need within their community to hopefully prevent acts of targeted violence. So at this point, it also feels probably like a good moment to segue into what we keep referring to as our push and pull factors. So these are sort of the environmental, social, economic, and political factors that feel like they either push an individual out of their community or perhaps pull them into another, oftentimes sort of simultaneously happening together. So, Colby, what kind of factors would you identify that would push an individual out of their community?
Absolutely, Elena, and thank you for kind of mentioning that caveat about we're not kind of insinuating that mental health or individuals with the psychological diagnoses are more at risk of permeating targeted violence in any kind of way. So thank you for kind of bringing up that caveat. But we do need to assess and look at how mental health and how communities and how environments can kind of exacerbate or help with an individual feeling more connected and not as prone to acting out in targeted violence uh, means. So, in terms of push and pull factors, that's a great concept. When I look at push and pull factors, I often look at it in the generic terminology of pushing someone down or pulling someone up, so to speak. But also, I don't want to give that kind of ideology where we look at pushing someone down as such a negative concept and pulling someone up as such a positive concept. While the direction and intention may seem obvious, we can still push someone into safety and pull someone into danger, if that makes sense. And we'll talk about push and pull factors and how they assist in the radicalization process to targeted violence, and how also they can be utilized to assist in the de-radicalization process. So first, I would like to give just kind of a working definition of both, so to speak. So like when we talk about pushing someone into radicalization or into targeted violence, there is the concept of radicalization, which is an ideological thought process that occurs that we'd kind of mentioned earlier. But then there is the process of mobilization to violence, which we show that a lot of individuals, the majority of individuals that have radicalized ideologies, do not necessarily engage in mobilization towards violence. I do want to make that a strong indicator as well, that there is a huge differentiation between the concept of being radicalized in terms of ideologically to mobilized. But when we look at push factors, what pushes someone into radicalization, these are conditions that are conducive to violent extremism and the structural context from which it emerges. These could include things such as a lack of socioeconomic opportunities, marginalization and discrimination, poor governance, violation of human rights and the rule of law, prolonged and unresolved conflicts, and also radicalization in incarceration settings, so to speak. So I'll put these into a little bit of a kind of case study here in a little bit to hopefully offer a little more context and examples of how push and pull factors work into pushing someone into targeted violence. But a pull factor as well is pulling someone into radicalization. As we kind of talked earlier, pulling someone up seems like a positive concept, but pulling someone into targeted violence, not necessarily. And so, and when pulling into radicalization, the individual's motivations and processes play a key role in transforming ideas and grievances into the violent extremist actions. So these could include like individual backgrounds and motivation. Again, we have the concept of a collective grievance, victimization stemming from domination, oppression, or foreign intervention, the distortion of or misuse of beliefs, as well as political ideologies and ethnic and cultural differences. When we look at kind of push and pull factors into radicalization, they usually affect the four kind of pillars of environmental push factors and pull factors: social, economic, and political. And so when we look at push factors in terms of environmental, this could be poverty. This could be something such as safety. The case study I'll kind of discuss here in a little bit was an action of gang violence, where the individual felt that they were pushed into acting based into a targeted violence situation and acting upon the ideations of the gang. Let me restate. So when we look at push factors in terms of environmental, we can look at concepts such as poverty. We can look at concepts such as oppression. Anything such as that where the individual feels their back is against the wall. And for one individual that I worked with years ago, their means of making money, of taking care of their family, the environmental circumstances, they had no educational opportunities, they stated. The work of situation was very dire. There was not a lot of jobs, and environmentally, there was not a lot of safety in the area in which they were living. So they felt pushed into the action of joining a gang and engaging in targeted violence with a drive-by shooting based upon their environmental factors. These can be social factors as well. A push factor can be alienation for an individual. They have no social contacts, and individuals come along that state that they can provide them with a community. Economic, again, that could be financial reasons. And then political, as we see the insurrection. A lot of individuals that have been interviewed and mentioned of their radicalized ideologies, not necessarily their mobilization to violence during that election cycle, felt truly that they had no other option. The election was completely stolen from them. And then we can look at how individuals are pulled into radicalization or targeted violence. So a pull factor would be something that encompasses or lures outside involvement that attract people towards a different lifestyle. So they're being pulled towards a more engaging lifestyle. So this could be, again, environmental, social, economic, or political when it comes into terms of being pushed or pulled into the concept of ideological radicalization to mobilization to radicalization.
You had mentioned it might be helpful to illustrate some of these concepts with a case study. I feel like because these concepts just are so fluid and abstract, that might be really helpful to discuss right now.
Absolutely. And out of the sake of obviously keeping confidentiality secured, I will kind of give a loose example of a case that was worked years ago where a 17-year-old individual that was a member of the Pern Bloods had onboarded with a gang and stated that when I interviewed them, the individual had professed that they had never seen themselves going down that route. Their mother was heavily involved with gang activity until she passed away of an illness very early, at 12 or 13 years of age in his life. His father had been incarcerated for actions and involvement with gangs as well. And this individual was living with his grandmother. Initially, he was impoverished, stating that him and his grandmother were living in poverty in Section 8 housing in the southeastern area of the United States. So environmentally, he was surrounded by poverty, surrounded by gangs, and felt that his environment was very unsafe. Socially, he had no involvement with friends unless gangs were a part of it. And economically, like we stated, financially, they were struggling. Environmentally, there was not safety around. Socially, there was a disconnect from community. Both parents were gone, no siblings around. Living with grandmother who was working pretty consistently at a hospital as a CNA. And so all of these factors, he stated, what choice did I have? I remember in the interview. The individual ended up acting upon a drive-by shooting at a recreational center when he was kind of told from other individuals, kind of these pull factors, that it would rank him higher in terms of his social. He would have more opportunity to move up into the gang. So that was a pull factor to engage in this. They stated also that with being higher up in the gang allowed him to kind of live more closer and surrounded by individuals that were high up in the gang, which environmentally provided him with more community, which was pulling him to do these actions. It provided him with more stability, he stated, knowing people had his back, etc. And also, he stated in a weird way, he took pleasure out of it because it made him feel like a different individual. It made him feel, as he stated, invincible. And so the individual did engage in a drive-by shooting at a recreational center where a rival gang was known to be hanging out periodically. I think the court report showed something around 10 shots were fired in the drive-by. I think there was some injury, but there was thankfully no loss of life in that. And he was incarcerated based upon that, where I was able to work with him. And in looking at these push and pull factors, there was times where he stated, yes, there is some where I sought kind of these pull factors. I sought more higher ranking in the gang that I was with. I sought more opportunity. I saw more stability in terms of moving up in the gang. But initially, he says what drove him to mobilization to radicalization violence was, he stated, the push factors. The environment was not safe. Socially, he was isolated. Economically, he did not have the resources and worried that his grandmother did not have the resources to support.
Thank you so much for sharing that case. I think it's really helpful to help illustrate a lot of these concepts which we've talked about. Introducing some grievances, those desires for protection, for a sense of purpose and identity and community. I think are really universal, and what is variable, to go back to sort of the static and dynamic factors you talked about, really is the environment that surrounds an individual. So thank you for sharing that. And I do just want to also point out at this time that individuals involved in recruitment of other such people can recognize these same push and pull factors that we are illustrating here, and they know how to leverage them to bring another individual into their group. So recruiters look for vulnerable individuals who are in need of that belonging, identity, purpose, and protection, and they radicalize them to violence through perhaps online forums and platforms. In this case, it sounds like through sort of the idea of protection and community. So for you all to be aware, if there are people in your life that you are worried about being radicalized towards violence, I do want to take a moment just to share some potential signs here on the next slide. And to be clear, these vary greatly. If there's one thing I think we've said pretty clearly throughout this, there's no obvious profile, but rather these pathways and sort of warning signs to be aware of. So some common indicators that we look at are if the individual is starting to withdraw from their family and their friends, they may begin to associate with known radicals or known perpetrators of violence. You may notice a change in their dress or some unusual financial transactions. They may be spending more time online. Their online behavior may change, so they might delete or lock social media accounts, instead choosing to participate in online sites or groups that share their radical ideologies or promote violent extremism. They may begin to share their own approval of violent attacks, expressing that violence is the only acceptable means of achieving their ideological goals, or they may share radical propaganda online or verbally. They may even begin to express their own desire to hurt others, or they may make violent outbursts. So this is by no means a comprehensive list, but certainly things to keep an eye out for. And if you do worry that someone in your life may be demonstrating some of these behaviors, it's not too late to step in and express your care and concern for them. And of course, if you need additional resources or support, you can reach out to us at the CRC as needed as well. But I want to go back to the interventions that you mentioned earlier, Colby, because it's clear that through some additional resourcing, mental health support, et cetera, that this individual was able to have moments of reflection and hopefully move towards the resiliency and change that, of course, we talk about in preventing targeted violence. So the good news, which you alluded to, is that the same way an individual can be pulled into a violent group, they can also be pulled out. So there may be multiple ways in which an individual moves away from violent extremism. They may disengage from the group and then de-radicalize, or perhaps they de-radicalize and then disengage from the community that pulled them in. Alternatively, they may disengage from a group but never de-radicalize, or they de-radicalize but never disengage from that community that pulled them in. So this is dependent on, of course, many factors and larger contexts. As we mentioned previously, individuals are pushed or pulled from groups based on very simple needs for identity, belonging, purpose, and protection. So Colby, what are some examples of factors that may push or pull an individual from a violent extremist group?
So when we talk about disengagement, disengagement is a behavioral change, such as leaving a violent extremist group or changing one's role within it. It does not necessitate a change in values or ideals, but requires relinquishing the objective of achieving change through violence. So there's no really one single factor that explains why people withdraw from high risk activism or political violence, so to speak, or targeted violence. Disengagement typically happens because of growing disagreements over time, as opposed to like one singular or triggering event. But also, the push and pull factors really come into play when we look at disengagement. So, common push factors, so to speak, out of targeted violent extremism would be like a disagreement over a group's strategies, their practices, or a disagreement over the utilization of violence. They showed that post 9/11, a majority of individuals in the United States that identified as Muslim identified the quote unquote war on terror as a war on their faith. Yet a very small percentage went from this radicalized ideology to this mobilized ideology. There can also be disillusionment with its leaders and members of the group or the targeted violent group. It can also be a loss of interest in faith or the group's ideology, or it can be dissatisfaction with their own personal role or contribution in terms of the targeted violence extremist group. Also, burnout could play a huge role into what pushes an individual out of targeted violence. They feel that they just can't manage that lifestyle anymore, so to speak. So, when we talk about pushing out of targeted violence or violent extremism, there's a theory out there called role exit theory, which is defined as the process of disengagement from a role that's central to one's self identity, and then the re-establishment of an identity in a new role that takes into account one's ex role. And what that kind of generally means is the role that the individual played in terms of the group that was radicalized towards violence should not be something that is glossed over, forgotten, or nudged out, so to speak, but it should be something that is addressed and taken into account when identifying a new role for the individual. And that is kind of push factors. These are factors that would push an individual from radicalization. And then when we look at pull factors, how an individual is pulled, so to speak, out of violent extremism, common pull factors include relationship with family members, friends, or other outside groups. So it is more a loyalty. It's an exchanging of loyalties from group to family or community. This could also be the desire to settle down, to marry, to start a family, almost maturation out of the process. And then there's also the concept of educational and employment opportunities, opportunities for an individual where they can see that these push factors that push them into targeted violence could be taken care of. And finally, with kind of pull factors or pulling an individual out of violent extremism, we'll kind of look at Dr. Craig Harper's idea, the desistance theory. In desistance theory, it's a criminological phenomenon which describes how criminal offenders stop their offending behavior. It's pertinent in forms of looking at the offender's rehabilitation, looking at their career as someone that was engaged in targeted violence, as well as having practical applications for individuals working with the individual trying to be pulled or wanting to be pulled out of violent extremism, which can be the affording of opportunities such as educational employment opportunities or social and communal opportunities as well.
Thank you for all of that context. I think that's really important that even if a person feels ready to disengage or de-radicalize from violent extremism, there are barriers that might prevent them from leaving, such as important social relationships, prestige, attention that they get, fear of losing protection or financial stability, all those things that you just mentioned. And what can combat that are really the systemic resourcing that is available to them in the community, those educational opportunities, financial opportunities, employment, et cetera. So I think that's really important for us to consider. And I know on a separate segment, we talk about public health systems and how those can contribute to preventing targeted violence. So I appreciate you bringing all of that up. And just as a helpful summary, I want to sort of split this into the idea of risk factors and protective factors. I think that for me, it's always helpful to think that there are risk factors that are characteristics that increase the likelihood of a person becoming a perpetrator of targeted violence. It's not a direct predictor or cause of targeted violence, of course. And on the other hand, we do have protective factors, which are characteristics that decrease the likelihood of a person becoming a perpetrator of targeted violence. Those essentially serving as a buffer against the previous risks. So what we want to consider in assessing someone's risk of being radicalized to violence is, do the protective factors in their life outweigh the risks that they've experienced? Risk factors can be individual characteristics such as the history of violent victimization, involvement with drugs and alcohol, antisocial beliefs and attitudes, low IQ, poor behavioral control, or early aggressive behavior. Some of those static and dynamic factors that we mentioned earlier. And I do just want to give a brief note here as well, that just as mental health concerns are not a direct cause for violence, neither, of course, is IQ level. What's important to consider is how an individual is made to feel either accepted or isolated due to their perceived intelligence. But risk factors might also exist within the family unit. Was there authoritarian parenting in the household, or harsh disciplinary practices, or low parental involvement? Were parents struggling with substance abuse, mental health concerns, or criminality? Then we're looking at sort of the larger social context at the peer level. Are individuals getting involved with gangs, or do they feel rejected by other peers? Do they have a lack of involvement in sort of conventional, socially acceptable activities? And then looking at sort of these larger systems that you just mentioned in the community, risk factors could be those diminished economic opportunities and high levels of poverty and high degrees of transiency, low levels of community engagement, et cetera. And on the flip side of all of those things, we have the protective factors. I don't know, Colby, if you want to share what protective factors might look like, but I think we sort of alluded to a lot of them. But what sort of would that look and feel like to an individual that they're experiencing some of those risk factors, and then we can introduce protective factors that help to sort of block the effects, if you will?
Absolutely, Elaine, and thank you for mentioning that, and thank you for also kind of mentioning the caveat that we're not insinuating that like IQ or a lower IQ or lower capacity for cognitive functioning indicates a higher correlation to targeted violence. So thank you for kind of parceling that out as well. But I do want to look at protective factors. Protective factors, as Elena was mentioning, we looked at the risk factors and how they fall under kind of those pillars necessarily of like individual, family, peer and social, as well as community risk factors. And just like that, protective factors have a play as well. When we look at individual protective factors, we can look at things that assist an individual, such as an intolerant attitude towards deviance, or things such as high developed social interaction or social skills. Even faith or religious belief ideologies can be of benefit, or highly developed skills for realistic planning, resiliency in terms of like looking at growth that they have occurred and navigated through past experiences that have been difficult for them. So, as stated, under protective factors, we, like the risk factors, can have individual protective factors, familial protective factors, peer and social protective factors, as well as community-based protective factors, which is where I think that we need to start looking in terms of what resources are available for individuals that have radicalized ideology that have yet to mobilize, and how do we link them into both individual personal growth? How do we assist their families or communities or peer and social groups to also be conducive to helping them assist with a de-radicalized ideology?
I really love that we are already introducing the idea of growth and how that can be the result of some of this disengagement or de-radicalization, and also a contributing factor to it. I think that's really important. And when you consider the pathways to violence perspective rather than a profiling technique, it's so clear through this discussion we've had today that there are so many points in an individual's process of radicalization to violence that we may be able to step in and create positive change that not only impacts the individual's life, but also the community at large. So, by looking at all of those potential risk factors, identifying elements that may either pull a person into the community or push them out, looking for some of those protective factors, and really listening for reactions to perceived grievances, we can influence whether or not someone feels a need to turn to a violent act. And I think what's important to note with that concept of growth is the Colorado Resilience Collaborative is so named because we believe in people's and communities' resilience, their ability to recover, heal, grow, strengthen. And in psychology, there's a concept that we know of as post-traumatic growth that describes the positive psychological changes that might sometimes result from overcoming traumatic experiences. Now, of course, it's important to note that the potential for post-traumatic growth does not outweigh the negative impacts of trauma, but there are countless examples of individuals who recover from traumatic experiences with renewed strength and gratitude, improved perceptions of the world and themselves, and new feelings of purpose. And these changes can happen at the community level as well. So, Dr. Colby, to end on this note of optimism, do you want to speak a little bit more about post-traumatic growth or vicarious resilience, and how those can contribute to our preventative model here of preventing targeted violence?
Absolutely, Elena. And I think that's a good note to end on. I know today we have talked about a lot of kind of heavy material, which indicates kind of how trauma it plays a role. While we do not have necessarily a profile for an individual that engages in targeted violence, we do understand the role in which trauma plays, and we understand the role in which risk and protective factors play, as well as which we had mentioned earlier, static and dynamic factors. And understanding, as we're all aware, I think the society has kind of this idea of what PTSD and trauma is. It's almost like a diagnosis du jour to describe any kind of ailment that has occurred. And we use the term loosely, but when we really look at trauma, I think we're starting to understand more and more as a society of the role in which it plays and a better understanding of how it affects individuals. But I think we focus less on some of the positive psychology, such as the terminology of like things such as post-traumatic growth, which you had mentioned, Elena. PTSD became a diagnosis in 1980. And it wasn't until the mid 1990s that Tedeschi and Calhoun started studying the concept of post-traumatic growth. To kind of define post-traumatic growth and end on a positive note, is post-traumatic growth is a theory that explains kind of a transformation that follows trauma and healing, kind of the rupture and repair of the traumatic circumstance, kind of the concept or analogy of an individual talking through their scabs as opposed to their scars, that the trauma has left a visible scar tissue, but that tissue is tougher and more resilient, but is still a representation of what the individual has endured. And so post-traumatic growth the concept was developed by Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun, and it states that it is the transformation following trauma. And as Dr. Tedeschi states that people develop new understandings of themselves, the world they live in, how to relate to other people, the kind of future they might have, and a better understanding of how to live life. So the optimism that is sold here is that while we do understand that violent extremism is a concept that we're becoming more familiar with, that every time we can flip on a television or a news station, it seems that we are in constant influx of violence occurring and trauma being a constant theme. The concept of collective trauma that we discussed earlier being almost a blanket that has been addressed over during and post-pandemic and our socio-political climate that has been the case over the course of the past number of years. But I think the optimism that we sell is, and the reason that mental health, I feel, is in the playing field of targeted violence, so to speak. And while we are kind of looking at concepts such as trauma and ideological thinking and how that attributes to violent extremism, I think that the optimistic note in which we end upon is that if we do our part and we set up communities that assist in risk factors, we set up programs, we make more accessible needs to mental health concerns, that I think that we'll see a collective traumatized community that is also a community that can engage in post-traumatic growth, and that we see, as Dr. Tedeschi so eloquently states, that we will have a better understanding of ourselves, the world in which we live in, how we relate to other individuals, and a better understanding of the future in the life in which we live.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Colby, and for joining us today to share all of your expertise. That was such a beautiful way to wrap up. So all of this to say, your engagement in this topic is crucial and could be extremely influential. As a community, we have far greater odds for recognizing risk, enhancing resources and relationships, and making positive changes. So we will continue here at the CRC to be committed to serving our communities alongside all of you listening. So please feel free to reach out to all of us at the CRC for any additional resources or support. And we thank you so much for listening today.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today. Your hosts from the Resilience Collaborative are myself, Elena Sawyer, program intern and graduate student at the University of Denver, and Dr. Maria Vukovic, the program director and research faculty at University of Denver. Our program is focused on strengthening prevention of targeted violence, identity-based violence, and hate. By offering extensive training, professional mental health consultation, and educational resources, our aim is to build the capacity of agencies, professionals, and communities to expand awareness and skills for identifying and responding to concerning behaviors related to targeted violence and hate. Our team includes experienced researchers, licensed providers, and educators who tailor prevention resources and recommendations to each referral. Our prevention program is housed within University of Denver's International Disaster Psychology, Trauma, and Global Mental Health graduate program. Our work is informed by expertise in mental health, trauma, war, conflict, culture, and the environment. As a reminder, it's very important that you take care of your own mental health throughout this recording. Your acute self-awareness and your active engagement in this topic are the best ways to help prevent targeted violence. We also want to remind you that the CRC takes an apolitical stance in sharing these anecdotes. That's not to say that everything we discuss is not politically motivated. Some of it is. Our aim is to present facts and to honor the dignity of everyone. Our work promotes prevention of violence, particularly against those who are most often targeted or minoritized. Our goal is to promote safety in our communities for everyone in our communities. In this segment, we're going to be looking more closely at what is meant by a public health approach to the prevention of targeted violence. We'll discuss how socioeconomic factors can both contribute to or impede the process of prevention. We will examine primary, secondary, and tertiary models of prevention. And we'll end with an explanation of the role that advocacy plays in public health and how you can stay involved to promote well-being in your community. There will be a second segment for a deeper dive into examples of community growth models that further describe the relationship between public health and targeted violence prevention. So you can listen on further for that in the future. So let's start off by establishing what is public health and how do we consider public health in our approach to preventing targeted violence. So Maria, can you start us off by introducing those concepts?
Absolutely. A public health approach to violence prevention has been used for more than 40 years. A public health approach consists of defining the problem of targeted violence, identifying risk and protect factors, and how they relate to pathways of violence for individuals, groups, and communities as a whole, developing and testing prevention strategies and interventions that can be used to reduce or mitigate the prevalence of targeted violence and its effects on communities. Can also be used to translate knowledge and disseminate evidence-proven models for practitioners and decision makers who are involved in advocacy and policy, which we'll talk more about later. Public health systems are also intended to address the inequities, expand resources, and spread awareness in communities. They are collaborative by nature and utilize skill sets and resources that already exist in social sectors, including medical systems, education programs, and legislative bodies, law enforcement, emergency response, and other organizations that focus on community infrastructure. For example, at one time there was a concern about children injuries resulting from car accidents. And a public health response that was applied to this social problem was passing legislation that required seatbelts and car seats for children, training police officers to enforce legislation, educating parents and children, and ensuring vehicles were equipped for seatbelts. From this example, we can also observe another important characteristic of public health programs. They are proactive by nature. Rather than only creating systems to help treat the injuries themselves, the approach looks at the causes and drivers of car accidents and injuries and develops programming to combat these. This is known as upstream programming, and it aligns nicely with our approach at the Resilience Collaborative to preventing targeted violence.
Thanks, Maria. Yeah, I think the notion of upstream programming is really significant to consider. Instead of just treating an injury, for example, we're looking at what caused it. And that feels really significant in regards to preventing targeted violence rather than simply responding to the violence, trying to prevent it from ever happening. So I want to bring in some of those socioeconomic factors that we've actually talked about in some other segments. In Module 2, Colby and I discussed the process of preventing targeted violence and how we take a holistic socio-ecological approach, which considers how an individual, their relationships, their community, and then the broader social context all interact. And this model indicates how each of those layers influence and are influenced by others. We use this model to consider how violence prevention programming can fit into each of those layers within the socio-ecological model. So for an example, an individual may report a history of abuse or a lack of educational opportunities. And then at the community level, we may question how safe a person feels in their neighborhood and what local resources are available to them, et cetera. In that same segment, Colby and I discussed the concept of grievances and of push and pull factors that influence an individual's decision to become engaged in violent extremism. So it's important to understand these concepts when evaluating public health approaches to targeted violence. So if we're looking at those examples, again, at the individual level, understanding a person's history of abuse or their lack of educational opportunities, a public health model will try to understand how, again, with upstream programming, how we can prevent those from playing out or how we can provide additional resources at those levels. Similarly, at the community level, if there's a lack of local resources in regards to safety, education, job opportunity, et cetera, an important step in the public health model of preventing targeted violence would be to increase some of those resources. So it's really looking at how those push and pull factors within each of those layers actually give an opportunity for public health systems to work to provide more of those resources upfront before the violence needs to occur. This relates, of course, to grievances. It's trying to prevent any of those grievances before they occur or mitigate the potential risks of those grievances. So, Maria, I wonder if you can expand a little bit on how structural and social determinants of public health relate to grievances and also provide context for those grievances to be exacerbated. I'm wondering how we sort of consider this at both a micro and macro level of this socio-ecological model.
So social determinants of health have long been the focus and framework really for public health approaches. They are the conditions and places where people live, learn, work, and play that affect a wide range of health risks and outcomes for our communities. There are a few different categories that I want to describe of social determinants of health, and then I'll talk more about how they relate to grievances and how inequities, risks associated with social determinants of health can really exacerbate and prolong grievances that then lead people into pathways to violence and mobilization to violent behavior. Healthcare access and quality is the connection between people's access to and understanding their health services and their own health and well-being. This can include access to healthcare services, particularly primary care, whether or not they have healthcare insurance coverage, and their literacy and background in understanding their own health and well-being, and what kinds of support structures they have in their lives to promote their health and well-being. Education access and quality is the connection of education to health and well-being. This can include key issues such as graduating from high school, or in general, the educational background that you've had access to, enrollment in higher education, and furthering your preparedness for a career, educational attainment in general, language and literacy, as well as early childhood education and development that really set a strong foundation for you to excel and thrive in relation to your health and well-being and education. Social and community context is the connection between characteristics of the context within which people live, learn, work, and play, and their health and well-being. This can include things like cohesion within a community, civic participation and engagement, discrimination, and again, prejudice and bias that plays out in inequities within communities, conditions in the workplace, and incarceration. Economic stability is the connection between financial resources that people have, including income, cost of living, other things related to quality of life economically, their social economic status, and how that relates to their health and well-being. So of course, things like poverty, employment, food security, and housing stability play into economic stability for people. And finally, neighborhood and built environment is the connection between where a person lives, including their housing, neighborhood, and environment, and how that relates to their health and well-being. So this is affected by things like quality of housing, access to transportation, availability of healthy food, air, water quality, as well as things like rates of neighborhood crime and violence in communities. So now I want to turn to talking a little bit about how these structural and social determinants of health, again, the conditions and places where we live, learn, work, and play, can affect a wide range of health risks and outcomes associated to violence. I'd like to remind us about the context for grievances and how these can be brought on and grow, as well as be exacerbated in our lives. There are a number of different types of grievances that we know have been shown to increase people's radicalization to violence, as well as mobilization to violent behavior. And these include ideological or belief-based grievances. For example, having fascist or anti-fascist beliefs associated with their faith or spiritual value systems, conspiracy beliefs. They can also be related to prejudice and bias-based grievances that can be associated with things like anti-immigration beliefs, anti-LGBTQI2+ beliefs, racism. These are very much tied to the inequities and life experiences and resources that people have had access to. Political grievances can also be a driver, and these can include anti-government, economic, and other types of political beliefs that motivate people to act violently.
Thanks for that explanation, Maria. I think what I really want to draw attention to in what you just said, where there are a lot of factors to consider that maybe people don't initially think to associate with targeted violence and violence prevention, things like clean water, clean air, access to jobs, things like that. They may not intuitively seem related, but all of those small factors give way to potential for grievances, for feelings of inequities that on a personal level can really start to build up and create, this sense of deep inequality, of some bitterness, of some of this need for their own feeling of justice or community, etc. And this is what relates so much to the push and pull factors that Colby and I spoke about in module 2, and how any of those seemingly small grievances can really build up and create this model that feels like it's potentially pushing them out of that community that they're in, pulling them into a more radicalized community that gives them a sense of safety, of justice, of identity, etc. And so I think it's really important to bring up all of those potential factors and how they relate to grievances, because it's so important to consider them all when looking at a preventative model, and how they all relate to public health in that way. So thank you for sharing those examples. I think that's really important. And on that note as well, I do want to just describe a little bit how we sort of segment out those different types of resourcing and programming. So we refer to these as a multi-level approach, which includes primary, secondary, and tertiary programming. So again, the socio-ecological model investigates how systems interact at multiple levels of a person's life and their surroundings. The primary, secondary, and tertiary programming sort of fits into those and refers to the time in which programming takes place. So primary prevention helps to strengthen protective factors that enhance an individual's quality of life and help them to avoid potential risk. So that is the idea of improving qualities of schools, of increasing safety in neighborhoods, of allowing more access to jobs, et cetera. All of those would be before engagement in targeted violence even happens, to create better resourcing, to prevent some of those grievances, to prevent some of those push factors. The secondary prevention programming supports those who may have already been exposed to some of those risk factors and trying to mitigate the effects of that exposure. And then the tertiary prevention programs aim to prevent recidivism to those who have already engaged in targeted violence, with the intent to prevent further or higher risk violent acts from occurring. So tertiary being that third stage, engaging with people who are already a part of those extremist groups or have already been radicalized to violence. And the idea is to either help try to pull them back out by creating more of those opportunities outside of the radicalized groups, or to just prevent some of the higher risk violent acts that can happen through a sense of community, through a different sense of identity, through more understanding, et cetera. So we have those three different sort of periods of time in which we can influence programming, and those all occur simultaneously alongside the socio-ecological model we've talked about before. So occurring at each of those levels of an individual's life and their community. Maria, because you have so much experience working with the CRC and the University of Denver, I wonder if you can share some examples of programming that might occur at each of those prevention stages, or talk more specifically about how the CRC really fits into that model.
Yes, so let me start with primary. Good examples of primary prevention programming often take place in schools because they are a central system that supports the community as a whole, in particular, young people and families. So community groups often focus on integrating in bullying support to help provide psychosocial resources, as well as mitigate the effects of bullying, reduce bullying behavior in schools. And that all is upstream programming at the primary level that is really targeting that reduction of risk. So a grievance linked to bullying is often something we see down the road. For example, in lone actors that do mobilize to violent behavior, and then maybe engaged in a incident of targeted violence in their community. So these types of primary programming really rely on material support that focuses on increasing access to resources for families, children and young people, as well as teachers, administrators, and other kinds of school personnel that are involved in that community. They strengthen access, as I said, to support, resources, and really expanding awareness of information related to risk of a certain type of behavior. For example, we talked about bullying. The emphasis community-wide is on engagement and participation across the community, increasing the visibility and access to resources and support. I'll turn next to approaches to secondary prevention. These often are more focused. They can be one-on-one or group approaches. A good example is counseling or mentoring interventions that really focus on addressing behaviors with empathy. So they are before often an actual mobilization to violent behavior, and focus on working with existing protective factors, pro-social skills, for example, and building from there to help foster a sense of strength and safety and belongingness for the individual or the group is at risk or already engaged in the pathway to violence. The emphasis here really is focused on peer support, so being able to facilitate groups for those who are experiencing distress, and oftentimes that is related to what we were discussing about grievances or often they themselves being the target of bullying or other kind of behavior that was rooted in prejudice and bias, and also protecting targeted individuals with a culturally responsive and trauma-informed approach. Another thing that's important is to reduce risk and threat by something called target hardening. And that can be done by building the capacity and training staff and community members on how to identify signs of targeted violence, for example, associated risks and threats, as well as build the capacity for a wide range of groups and members in the community to serve as bystanders and upstanders for when they may be encountering or observing concerning behaviors. Finally, approaches to tertiary prevention might include specialized psychotherapeutic services or psychiatric support, and these can often play an important role in addressing specific traumatic impacts for victims or survivors of incidents, as well as people who have radicalized and been involved in actually acting out in violent ways that target people or places. Sometimes there's a focus on reintegration that enhances the ability for people who have perpetrated violence and been swept up in pathways to violence to re-engage in their communities and disengage from those pathways to violence. The focus here is on facilitating spaces that allow the person to work from their strengths and reduce sources of distress or other motivating factors, often again tied to grievances or ways that they individually have been targeted themselves in their lives, to protect individuals and other groups in the community through a trauma-informed, again, a culturally responsive approach. And oftentimes, too, this is where threat assessment comes in, and there may be a partnership formed through a multi-interdisciplinary team, right, where there's law enforcement involved in many cases, or other kinds of emergency responders, really working to protect the security and safety of a community or an environment, working alongside different kinds of service providers who have that specialized therapeutic or management role for an individual or group that's involved in the concerning behavior or pathway to violence, and all working to assess, kind of what are the sources of grievances? What are the drivers of the violent behavior and ideologies? And then working together collaboratively and holistically to try to reduce that behavior and instead promote protective and healthy behaviors.
Yeah, I think that collaboration is so important when we're considering the public health model and how we're engaging at all different times of potential radicalization across all of those different socio-ecological layers. It's important to consider who might be involved in that. And what I appreciate about the CRC, and for anyone listening who is having those concerns, the CRC is really able to collaborate with you and with other systems at each of those levels. So we offer sort of the preventative training and education, as well as consultation if it's later on in sort of the radicalization process. And so if you have any concerns about that, of course, reach out to the CRC. We'll share our information, as always, again, at the end, as well as in the notes below. And you may be listening to some of this and sort of wondering how you personally can be engaged in this level of collaboration. It sounds overwhelming when we're talking about, some of this collaboration across layers of society and your communities, to wonder how you might be able to make a difference in that. And I think what is clear and what we want to really emphasize in the end of this segment is that looking at this public health model and how it relates in each of these preventative stages, it's clear that we have to have adequate resources available to individuals and communities. So all the strategies and resources that Maria mentioned require some amount of social and economic support. Economic and resource-related inequities obviously negatively impact pathways to violence and impede sustainable prevention strategies. So this again relates back to those concepts of push and pull factors that we addressed in module 2. And if a young person is exposed to, let's say, substance abuse in their house, for example, this doesn't guarantee that they will be engaged in targeted violence. If the individual has access to other safe spaces, free or affordable mental health resources, as Maria, you mentioned, and some supportive academic environments, their risk for engaging in violence may be very much decreased or even completely eradicated. And this is why it's so important for all of you to get involved as advocates for effective preventative programming in your community. Everyone can be involved as an advocate. Navigating social and political systems may seem daunting, but everyone has the ability to get involved and to truly make a difference. First, I'll just remind everyone to please pay attention to local elections and research which candidates seek to provide supportive systems in your communities. Write letters to local legislators. Speak up at town, county, or state legislative meetings about programming and resources that would be helpful in your community. Get involved in groups or organizations that are actively working to create positive social change in your community. Again, I realize all of this may sound daunting, but every voice is important when it comes to building up social resources and preventing targeted violence. It may be that some resources don't exist simply because no one has asked for them before, or have made local officials aware of their significance. People may not realize, again, as we had mentioned previously, how some even small changes, such as improving education or air quality, has an impact on targeted violence. So I just want to share a few tips for advocating. Advocacy is really something that I enjoy and find really important. And again, I know it seems daunting, but you really are an expert in your own community. And so I want to provide a few tips just to help empower you to get involved in sort of those legislative processes. And then I do want to pass back over to you, Maria, after this, because I know you're also engaged in advocacy through more of a research lens. And so I want to share that as well. For those of you thinking of getting involved in local legislation, here are sort of some tips for you. First, keep it short. If you're speaking at a local meeting, or you're writing a letter, or even if you get to meet some of your legislative officials in person, all of these local policymakers are extremely busy and on a very tight schedule. They want to be able to quickly understand what you're proposing and why it would be helpful. So make sure that you practice having just a couple minutes little speech. We call them elevator pitches. So imagine that you only have the amount of time it takes to go upstairs in an elevator. What can you say in that amount of time that really emphasizes what the problem is, what would be a useful solution, and therefore why you're proposing it? Number 2, research your local officials. You don't need to run a full background check on anyone, but it is really helpful to know what issues are important to your local leaders so that you can communicate your points effectively. What bills have they helped to push forward in the past? How might that connect to what you're asking for in your community? Number 3, identify ways to advocate that promote the equity and inclusion of everyone in your communities. You want to mitigate the role of oppression and injustice and offer some shared ownership of all stakeholders who are involved or affected. So getting your entire community involved in these efforts, making sure you're hearing from other voices who may be in minoritized communities, and understanding how it may affect all levels of your community. Keep all of those people involved as you work through advocacy so that everyone feels like an equal stakeholder in what you're proposing. Number 4, stay solutions focused. So don't just go and raise your concerns, but offer solutions. Particularly in the process of preventing targeted violence, share how specific programs or resources can be used to promote safety in your neighborhood. Feel free to use some of the examples even that we shared here today. 5, have confidence in your position as an expert. Yes, you are an expert. Many people might be worried about speaking up because they feel they don't have enough expertise on a subject, but that's actually not true. As a member of your community, you are knowledgeable about the needs that we want to address, and you're exactly the expert voice that they need to hear from. If you're giving professional testimony or you're advocating from a place of leadership, just make sure you collaborate with other community members so you understand their unique needs and their insights on the solution as well. And number 6, make it meaningful. Your letter or your public testimony doesn't have to be a list of facts and figures. In fact, usually what makes your suggestion more memorable is your personal voice, your story. Share anecdotes that make the issue feel real and the solution seem achievable. That's what's going to be memorable. So Maria, I want to pass it over to you as well, because I know that you are such an amazing advocate in our local community and have been doing this for a long time through the lens of research and also community-based participatory programs. So can you share a little bit more about what community-based participatory research is and tell us a little bit about what that programming looks like?
Yes. So my background is in community-based participatory research. And the reason I love this approach so much is that it offers an equitable process for community members, organizational representatives, researchers, other kinds of decision makers or leaders and elders in the community to all come together and have equal voice and action related to a problem or an experience or phenomenon that's going on in the community that is affecting them. The aim of community-based participatory research is to increase knowledge and understanding of a problem or phenomenon or experience that's going on in a community and integrate in that increased awareness and understanding or evidence that's gained through interventions and studies and connect that to policy change that is really aimed at improving health and quality of life for a whole community. Sometimes it goes beyond community into thinking of kind of whole of society. Within this context, we really like to think about community as a unit of identity. So that can refer to the different kinds of identities that people might like have social membership to, for example, or things like their family, social network, their geographic neighborhood, ways that people have connection and belongingness in their life. Another important feature is the fact that not only people have a sense of identification and emotional connection to other members who have that identity, but there are also common symbol systems, values, and norms within communities, shared interests and mutual needs and solutions, right? In ways that people approach their lives together. Sometimes communities of identity are geographically bounded in a neighborhood, for example, or they may share a similar cultural background, or, for example, be of a certain social membership, such as LGBTQI2+, for example. Many people have multiple overlapping communities of identity. And I think it's important to think of it as a fluid and dynamic process that is multifaceted rather than static and siloed in specific singular identities. So these kinds of principles within community-based participatory research can be applied more effectively to increase community engagement and ownership in the prevention measures and interventions that we use to reduce targeted violence and violent extremism in our communities. If you're advocating through a group, organization, or through research, we want to leave you with a few ways that you can utilize a community-based participatory research approach to mitigate and reduce violence and extremism that is affecting your community in particular. First of all, think about ways that you can involve community members in the analysis that you're doing, in interpretations and ways that you translate what you learn from analysis, as well as incorporating their involvement, their voice, their action in proposed solutions that come from any kind of analysis that you're doing in a community. Be sure that all collaborators, including this can be people in government roles, people working in health systems, or community members and families in particular, or community leaders and elders, people who may be leading the research. All of these different collaborators are credited and have a meaningful role in identifying and establishing what the solutions are that come out of the work that you're doing together, and that it's not lip service, but rather it is kind of a shared collaborative effort to identify what those solutions will be, and then the sort of subsequent actions that can be implemented through programming, et cetera, in the community. When you're sharing, translating what you're learning from the work that you're doing in the community, again, include all the different stakeholders and partners at every different level. And probably most importantly, think about the educational backgrounds, the professional backgrounds, the literacy, the culture, the values and norms of all the different stakeholders and partners that are involved in the work, and adjust how you're communicating about what you're learning so that it will be meaningful to each type of stakeholder and partner that you're sharing information with. Try to work to ensure that the solutions and kind of subsequent programming that you implement are going to be sustainable and feasible long-term in a community. And it's not something that is a temporary solution or something that will make the community more reliant on people that are coming in from outside of the community, for example. That can be very detrimental and actually exacerbate inequities that communities face.
Thank you for sharing all of that, Maria. And I just want to, echo again how much I appreciate all of your work in the advocacy space. It's been really helpful to learn more about how research even comes from that community position and is helping to support our communities combating targeted violence and creating more equity and inclusion for everyone in our communities. It's so important to all of us here at the CRC, and it's really helpful to be aware that such programming exists. So to all of you listening, I just again want to encourage all of you to consider what position you can take and be an advocate for such programming in your own communities. This can be anything from small collaboration with local organizations to larger, again, research-based programming or advocacy with your local legislative groups. All of it is really important. And again, it's going to take all of us together to take this public health approach to preventing targeted violence. So as we mentioned earlier, there will be a second segment here to discuss community-based growth programming. So stay tuned for that. And as always, just as a reminder, the CRC is really committed to serving you, working alongside you to strengthen safety, belonging, and resilience in our communities is what drives our work. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us for any additional resources or support. Our contact information, as always, is below, and we're happy to step in any way we can to support you. Thank you so much for listening.